Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our Fullcast Fireside Chat. I am your host, Tyler Simons. I'm the head of customer success at Fullcast, and we are a go-to-market planning and execution platform. For today's topic, we are going to be discussing a centralized versus a decentralized setup for both field operations and also what it might look like on the RevOps side and your structure there. So we're going to have a really interesting topic. Our guest today is Brian Selby, and I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Brian Selby. I am an independent consultant now, but have had a long, almost 30-year career in sales operations, management consulting, spent about a decade at McKinsey & Company, and was a partner there leading the sales operations practice for McKinsey, working with a lot of companies across industries on various sales transformation, sales operations topics. Then also had a long stint at Microsoft, where I was building and leading sales operations or sales excellence teams across the company. And then most recently was the head of sales operations and COO at Tableau Software, which is a Salesforce company, where I also built the sales operations team and led that organization for almost 4 years. So long career in sales operations. It's my passion. It's what I love to do. And I'm really excited to be able to spend a few minutes today sharing some insights and perspectives on a very important topic, for all of us in this profession, how to think about, centralization and decentralization. So great to be here, Tyler, and looking forward to our conversation.
It's probably fair to say that you've seen quite a few of different models in your career. So we're going to start super small. We're going to start with field operations, and we're going to think about a really tiny company that's just kind of getting started, and maybe, I've got a team. I'm going to be expanding it this year. I'm currently centralized. Everybody's in Denver. And as I'm starting to think about expanding, one, I want to know about the trade-offs between going centralized versus decentralized with my field operations team. And then two, which we'll cover a little bit later, you don't need to answer this, which would be the key indicators of when I need to make that leap into decentralization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, the question always comes down, or the principle usually comes down to what needs to be closest to the customer, and it's a balance between effectiveness and efficiency, and there's a lot of trade-offs that go into that, that sort of discussion and calculation. But and when I say closest to the customer, that can also mean in our sales operations or field operations context, it can be closest to the seller, closest to those individuals that are closest to the customer. And typically what that means, when you think about a field operations team, is, there's a balance here between, driving economies of scale and having things centralized so that you get those efficiencies, you drive standardization, you drive the most effective way and efficient way of deploying scarce resources, in an optimal way, versus having resources, close to the sales team, so that the sales teams feel like they're invested, in what we're doing, from an operations standpoint, that they feel like they've got resources that understand their business and can actually provide, that level of insight, and, direct engagement with sales teams, whether it be, in a business unit or in a geography. And so those are typically the sort of questions I always ask. And when I was building teams at, Microsoft or Tableau, for instance, I was evaluating, okay, for that particular function, for that resource, should that be, part of the local team, even though they may be part of a virtual community of sales operations professionals, but does it make sense, to have that resourced, out in, Europe, in the UK, or is it better to have that resource, in, the headquarters in Seattle, because there's economies of scale and you don't want to duplicate functions across multiple geographies.
See, I think you're touching on a really interesting point, which is really also not just about the sales people themselves, but also the resources that support the salespeople and where they need to be. I want to get to that, so I'm going to put a pin in that because I think that's going to tie into what we're kind of hitting early on here, which is, and I probably maybe gave myself a little misnomer, which is like insights, right? So we've got inside sales, they're all based in Denver, and then we've got essentially your field operations, which are usually meeting the customer. Is there like um, is there like a size or something that you're seeing where you're like, hey, we need to have field sales in visiting customers because that's going to be more effective, even though we know it's going to be less efficient, it's going to be more effective in the long term. And I think really what I want to understand is that balance between efficiency and effectiveness for the sales organization. And then we'll come back to this sales support because that's going to be super key because that ties back in.
Yep. No, it's a great question. It's the same principle at play, whether you're talking about sales resources or sales operations resources. And the way I've always thought about sales, and we had this example a lot at Tableau, because Tableau kind of grew up as an inside sales organization. It was very much a land and expand model, sort of a typical software model where you're driving growth through viral adoption, and it's less important to have a deep relationship with a customer where you're really understanding the ins and outs of their business, and you're building that long-term growth model with increasing size of deal that you're doing, and more strategic deals over time. It's really about just getting access to customers and following up on leads and converting those leads in the most efficient way possible. And so it typically leads to an inside sales function with sales development resources following up on leads, and then inside sellers pursuing those opportunities and converting them. And typically those resources, it's more important to be efficient in deploying those resources and driving a lot of teaming and knowledge sharing and best practice sharing and managing the utilization of those resources. And so you tend to see those resources hubbed, but they're not necessarily always hubbed in the headquarters. They will sometimes be hubbed in different regional offices so that you can take advantage of time zone differences. For instance, you don't want to be calling on European customers from Seattle, right? Just because the time zone differences will eat you alive. But then when you start to make that transition to more of I would say an enterprise go-to-market model where you're trying to develop, long-term strategic relationships, you're talking about longer sales cycles where there's multiple interactions with the customer. And customers typically, when they're spending, large amounts of money, they expect to see someone in person. They, at least in the old days. Today, that may be changing with, the new remote model, and everybody's comfortable selling on Zoom. But typically, even in today's world, you would expect with an enterprise go-to-market model, you'd have a greater emphasis on the effectiveness of selling and having those customer-facing resources in the geographies where those customers are, and so you trade off a little bit of that efficiency and the pooling effects that you get with an inside sales model for having resources that can be on site, that can be embedded with a few accounts and really get to know that customer and develop a long-term relationship that leads to higher ASPs over time.
Is there any sort of efficiency gain when you move to a decentralized model like you're talking about? Maybe around like just market knowledge, like this market, you could say this, New York is a very different market than maybe Southern California or San Francisco. And there's maybe a little bit of efficiency gain, maybe not enough to like offset the fact that everyone's decentralized, but have you seen that in in your world?
Yeah. The way I look at it is I sort of take it one level higher, which is productivity, sales productivity, which is a combination of efficiency and effectiveness. And when you do get to that sort of point in your maturity and your growth curve where, just churning out new accounts, in small transaction sizes isn't going to get you the growth, rate that you need, and you need to move to more of a long-term relationship, $1 million deals plus. That's when it's less efficient from a resource optimization standpoint, but it's more productive because your deal size goes up, right? So you do see that increase in productivity because you're putting resources, and typically more expensive resources, but higher skilled resources, in those closer to the customer, and therefore you're going to see higher deal sizes and potentially even higher win rates than what you would have had if it was just a pure transactional model done through inside sales. We saw that a lot in Tableau, particularly places like Europe, where we started out with primarily inside sales out of London, calling into Germany, France, Scandinavia. And when we started to put resources on the ground, in those markets, that's when you really start to see, growth take off, because you're starting to have those relationships with government entities, or have those relationships with, the larger banks, and private institutions in those markets.
Is there any indicators in data that tells you it's time to do that? Or is there like a plateau almost that you see with inside sales that says like, we've done really well, we're starting to see that plateau a little bit, and now it's time to really start to think about like pushing up deal sizes, which means we need to go into market?
Yeah, it typically happens when that pace of new customer acquisition starts to slow down, or you start to hit, the growth curve starts to flatten out.
Yeah.
And this happened again. I'll pick on Tableau again. This is recent, right? That happened to Tableau in 2015, 2016. That sort of viral, new customer acquisition, land and expand model had worked beautifully. Revenue was doubling, every year for a decade. But then, you hit that wall where, okay, now we're not getting that sort of same rate of new customer acquisition.
It's like the velocity.
The velocity and the growth, isn't doubling anymore. Now it's, starting to slow down, and you realize, okay, we've kind of not saturated, but you've gotten to a point where if you want to get that next growth curve, you got to do something different, right? You have to innovate the go-to-market model and start, going after larger, enterprise-wide deals, because that's where you get the efficiency, where you can get, thousands of users, at one in one deal, as opposed to trying to get that 10,000 users, one user at a time, or 10 users at a time. That doesn't scale when you start to get to, I don't know what the number is, $100 million of ARR, 500 million of ARR.
It's probably different for each person and really the key indicator which we hit on is really this plateauing in whatever metric that you're really focused on. And knowing the need to switch things up. Just anecdotally with our customers in the planning cycle, and this kind of goes back to what you're talking about, where maybe it's changing a little bit with the fact that everyone's being so remote, but I think we're still seeing a lot of our customers plan, specifically at the enterprise level, still very focused on geos, because the goal is to get back out there, because there's still nothing better than face-to-face and meeting with people and building those relationships. So hopefully we all get back to that. But it's like this. Do we change? Do we flip it? We're not really ready to, go centralized with enterprise sales. It doesn't quite make sense yet. So let's talk about this. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, well, just one little point. We talked about this before. I think even as, there is this trend towards, people can work from anywhere, and, sales organizations could hire sellers, in every part of the world. It doesn't matter. I think it still does matter. There's a limit to how distributed and how remote, a sales team could be, because there is a certain amount of teamwork and sales culture that you build when you're, physically in the same location. Even if you're spending all your time on the road with customers, you do still have that home office that you can come to, or if you're in inside sales, you have that bullpen that you can be a part of. I don't think we'll ever lose that, because that is part of sales and part of the way that you maximize efficiency and effectiveness is having that connection, so you can share best practices, so you can learn from each other and not be just on a phone in some far-reaching part of the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go back to the thing I put a pin in, which was our sales support. And let's talk a little bit about that. And you were starting to touch on, how, there are maybe certain functions that when they're centralized, you gain a lot of efficiency, but maybe there are also other functions that if they're centralized, don't really help with effectiveness of that, right? And so there's this, which ones can we bring and centralize? Which ones should stay decentralized in making these decisions? So wondering if you can just touch a little bit on that, and maybe going back to our indicators of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense would be helpful.
Sure. No, and again, it comes back to this, this balance of, as a sales operations leader or revenue operations leader, you're trying to drive a level of standardization. You're trying to drive, a level of efficiency in how you do things across the company. Because, at the end of the day, you don't want 1,000 flowers blooming when you're trying to run a railroad, right? You don't want everybody doing forecasting different. You don't want, people training sellers, using different methodologies or, different tools, different content. And you've got to have a single source of truth, right? A lot of companies I work with, the number one thing they're struggling with is just, having a single source of truth so that, they can actually evaluate the performance of the business. And so if you go too far down that distributed path where everybody can do it where they want to, and you have all the resources, at the end nodes of the branch, that's not going to work. But on the same token, putting everything in the headquarters, that doesn't work either, because then you don't have the buy-in and the relevancy and the insight into how the businesses are performing. So there's a continuum here, and in my experience, when I've built teams at Microsoft or built teams at Tableau or advised other companies, it does come down to certain functions fit better into one model or the other, and then there's some that are hybrid. So for instance, on the totally centralized, it makes sense to have a process and systems strategy and the sort of the decision making and the build out of systems done centrally, right? You don't want every country deciding what forecasting tool they want to use, or how they want to implement the CRM system or taxonomy. You want one sales methodology enabled by a core set of systems. So that to me is central. Things like incentive comp plan design, those types, that needs to be done once. You don't want every country manager deciding how they want to compensate their sellers. That gets you into legal trouble, but also just, again, not an efficient way of running the railroad.
I was going to ask about comp.
Yeah. So comp's one where operations of comp, payouts, coordinating with HR, coordinating with finance on calculating the attainment payouts, working with payroll. That fits very much a centralized model, and I would not distribute that out to the field. There are other things like transaction processing, quoting. Those are the types of things that typically it may be a global function, but a lot of the resources are going to be in the field, right? Because that's where you need to be in the right time zone. You need quick turnarounds. You don't want somebody in Germany waiting for somebody in the U.S. to wake up, to be able to process a quote or turn around, a quote, for the customer. So those resources, typically, you'd say put those out in the regions. In some cases, if you're a big enough company, you can have them by country. Even if they're, located in Dublin, they might be, arranged or pooled, by country for language purposes, and just, again, customer centricity. Then there are teams that I typically say would be in the middle, where I have had some parts that were global, that were part of the headquarters team, and then there were other parts that were in the field. And so think of things like business intelligence and analytics and reporting. Clearly, you want to have a center of excellence at the headquarters where you're designing the data model, you're sort of agreeing on the data definitions, and you're building.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, what about like data definitions and things like that? Do you just let everybody do whatever they want?
No, that's one where my experience, and I've seen the worst of this, where at Microsoft we had a situation where we had 13 sort of geographical units, and most of them kind of had slightly different definitions for pipeline. What was qualified over here was different over here. We had weighted pipe, high pipe, low pipe. People would pull it at different timestamps to run their pipeline reports, and that's just too hard to run a company of any scale when you're doing it in that much of a distributed fashion. You can imagine the roll-ups to the COO of the company were impossible.
Yeah, or the COO's got to like remember what all the definitions are and then try to like compare or contrast and do all these different things.
Or you spend more time in a meeting debating the numbers. Like, well, why is your number different than my number? Well, I pulled it, Friday at 5 p.m. Well, I pulled it, Friday at 8 a.m.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
And those kinds of things can really detract from your overall productivity as a company. So the definitions, the data governance, the things as simple as like the look and feel of standard reports, dashboard design, that's the kind of thing where for the core things that you're using every day, every week, pipeline reports, forecasting dashboards, renewal information, rates, those kinds of things that you want to have standard definitions and standard reports that go out to every region so that they can be looking at the same numbers that you're looking at. Now, having said that, there is a need though to have resources on the ground in the geographies or in the business units that can do ad hoc analysis, right? There's no way you can run a company of any scale if everybody is doing all the analytics in the center. Just because you need to be closer to the sales teams to understand what questions are they asking, what are the performance imperatives or the challenges that they're seeing, and then being able to interrogate the data to ask questions about the data that can lead to insight specific for that group, whether it's the U.S. public sector team or it's the UK financial services team or China. They're all going to have different needs. And so having analyst resources, and I had teams in both companies where there were analysts that sat in the subsidiaries. They might be still dotted line to me, and that's a whole different conversation about whether solid or dotted line reporting. But if they were part of the sales operations or field operations community, but they sat in the theater or they sat in the region, and they were considered part of that local sales leader's team, which I think is important to have that connection to the business, to be able to really understand the nuances of how those businesses operate so that you can add value to that particular sales leader and that sales leader's team in terms of the types of analytics you can do and the insight that you can bring to the business. So that's where it was a hybrid model where you have standards at the center, and you kind of have some consistency in how you think about the business and how you think about the analytics, but then having resources in the field that could do the ad hoc analytics and be there to be responsive to the sales teams, not just taking orders, right, but to be responsive and value add is important.
What would be so we talked about some of the things, right, like related to maybe your data's, you're struggling with different data definitions, or you're kind of seeing multiple comp plans and things like that. I just want to just briefly touch on maybe some of the signals that people out there should take a look at and maybe recognize that it's maybe time to either bring this in and make a change, essentially. And that might be decentralization, because you're trying to add flexibility to an analyst that's going to go sit in UK to work with the sales leader, or it might be centralizing in the case of like standardizing definitions. And maybe it's just as simple as we have a lot of definitions and we need to solve this problem. But I was wondering if you can just touch on maybe some key signals or things that say, hey, it's time to make a change.
Yeah. So what I've typically seen is, I kind of alluded to it earlier. If you are spending as a go-to-market, leadership team, if you're spending more time debating the numbers, in meetings, and I've seen this, at companies as successful and mature as Microsoft, to small companies that are just getting started. There's a lot of churn that happens just in trying to figure out, well, why is this number different than this number? And if you're, in an hour meeting, if you're spending the first 20 minutes just trying to figure out why these numbers don't make sense, that's an issue, right? Because you should be spending the majority of your time not debating the numbers, but trying to figure out, well, what do these numbers mean? What do they tell us about how we're doing and what we need to do differently? So that's one marker that would say, okay, probably time to call time out, and let's get everything aligned in terms of definitions and data sources and standard reports and dashboards, and just get the house in order there, and pivot away from that kind of decentralized approach. By the same token, and this is something I'm a big believer in, listen to what your stakeholders are telling you. If what they're saying is, hey, that stuff that's being produced by the central team, it's good, but it's not enough, right? We need more insight. We need more relevancy. That's great as a one size fits all, but again, I'll go back to the standard example I give is, public sector. There's just unique requirements, about the public sector business. There's unique aspects of how government sales, or education sales work that if you don't actually have the analytics or the training, or in some cases, the sales processes tuned, then you're missing, a step. And that's where I would say, okay, maybe that's now an opportunity to invest in, a dedicated resource or resources for that particular business. Or, the example of China, if you start going big in China, there's a lot of nuances in the Chinese market that don't match what you do, in the US, for instance, or even in Europe. And so having, resources that speak the language, first of all, because that's an important part of, of what we do in sales operations, is being able to communicate, but also just having people on the ground who can understand the unique aspects of doing business in China. So just listening, right, to your colleagues and your peers, and say, okay, are we providing you what you need to run your business effectively?
Yeah. So I think we got 2 minutes left. There's just one, you and I talked before this, and there's one thing I just thought was super interesting, and you touched on it this time, which was a little bit on the dotted line aspect of terms of really like a matrix of org design, right? Where you kind of almost have like two people that you report to. And I just want to, I guess it's like a 1 minute summary of like the benefits of maybe having somebody in sales ops sitting in UK directly reporting to the sales leader versus directly reporting to the global head of operations.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I've seen it both ways. I've seen it, done a number of different ways. My personal experience is I believe that those distributed resources, the sales operations resources that are aligned and assigned to geographies, are best suited if they report directly, into those field leaders, because then they're part of the team, right? Yeah. They're considered part of that sales organization. They're trusted advisor to the sales leader or sales manager in that particular geography. And I think they can be more effective and more influential when they're considered part of that team. But by the same token, in the same breath, having that dotted line connection back to the central sales operations organization, so that they're part of that community and that they can actually benefit from the strategic discussions and understanding the direction and the standards and the policies and the best practices from across the organization, that's an important balance. And I've run teams where that's worked really effectively. It does require those individuals to be really good at managing in a matrix and operating in a matrix, right? Where you do have two bosses. You have your direct boss, which is the sales leader, and your indirect boss, which is the sales operations leader, usually back at the headquarters. And, that takes a certain skill set to be able to navigate that effectively. But those who do, I've seen be incredibly successful and build a very successful long-term career in sales and sales operations.
That's perfect. All right, so we are just out of time. Before we wrap, I do want to say that the next Fireside Chat's going to be February 8th, and we're going to be talking about A to Z territories. It's going to be interesting. So hopefully everyone tunes in for that. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you imparting all of this wonderful knowledge. Now I got to go think about my own org design here and how these things are going to work.
Great. Well, thank you, Tyler. It's been a pleasure. And these are super interesting and super important topics for anybody in our profession to think through. So happy to share some lessons learned and knowledge from my past experiences. Thank you again.
Yep. Until next time. Have a good one, Brian.
Next time. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
See ya.